I would like to introduce Quintin Gray, President and CEO of Q Gray and Associates, a consulting business that helps companies and organizations market food products around the world. He is the former Agriculture Counselor at the U.S. Consulate in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and former Agricultural Trade Officer. I would like to welcome Quintin Gray.
Okay, good morning, and thank you for joining the webinar today. I want to make this webinar as practical as possible. I will define halal and discuss briefly how it differs from Jewish kosher, explain how the product certified halal has broadened over the years to include non-meat items such as cosmetics, etc., and talk about the Muslim consumer market size, discuss multinational companies that have invested heavily in halal foods, and give you some practical steps on how to get your share of the $1 trillion Asian Middle East halal market. First, and when I say something is important, it doesn't mean that everything I said previously is not important, but it means that you have to pay special attention to certain things in order to follow the conversation. But in order to understand halal, you have to get a certain amount of understanding of the historical and religious perspective of the issue. And I start by defining or saying that there are three monotheistic religions, that is, religions that believe in one God: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in order to understand halal, you have to understand how it all works together. In Judaism, about 3,600 years ago, Moses, according to the religion, by revelation from God, codified dietary norms and restrictions for Jewish people in the Torah. The Torah is the religious book for Judaism. It specifies which animals not to eat, such as pigs, eagles, vultures, ravens, owls, etc., and which animals are permitted to eat and how those animals should be slaughtered. Alcohol was not forbidden. When a food meets the Jewish dietary guidelines, it is considered kosher. So I mentioned that first because this is how it all, in a sense, started. Then Christianity is based on the life of Jesus Christ, which is about 2,000 years ago. Although born Jewish, Christ did not mandate strict religious dietary restrictions and allow followers to wide discretion in the kinds of foods to eat and on what to drink. All foods were permitted and alcohol was not forbidden. The first 5 books of the Christian Bible are the Torah that Moses wrote. You see the connection there. They're linked. And in Islam, about 1,400 years ago, the Prophet Muhammad received the Quran, according to the religion, by revelation from God. In the Quran, Muslim followers are required to adhere to strict dietary restrictions that align closely with kosher restrictions, but there are differences that I will discuss in a minute. Muslims believe that the Quran confirms the Torah's revelations that Moses received from God and consider Moses as a messenger and prophet. Okay. That brings us that gives you a historical perspective as to how dietary restrictions are considered in the world in general. Those 2 big categories of dietary restrictions, that's halal and kosher, and how they relate. And I'll talk a little bit more further in the presentation, a few things that are similar and some things that are distant, that are different. Okay, now I was the agricultural trade officer at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And I cannot believe it, but it was almost 20 years ago now. It's hard for me to believe how time has flown. But one of the first things I did when I was there was I attended a halal conference. And at the conference, there was a big debate going on about whether or not an animal should be stunned before it's killed, etc., before it's slaughtered, what halal really means. Why don't Muslim nations have one standard for halal slaughter and for halal foods? This was 20 years ago. And believe me, the situation now has changed significantly between then and now. And that I'll cover a little bit later as well. But what I want to do is, first of all, as I said, give you a definition of halal and focus now mostly on halal. And I'll refer to kosher a little bit later too, again. But halal is an Arabic word meaning the lawful or permitted. In reference to food, it is the dietary standard as prescribed in the Quran, written about 633 AD, about 1400 years ago. The Quran specifies what foods are permissible. Now, when you have something that's halal, then you have something else that has to be considered when you're exporting food to a Muslim country. And that is the opposite of halal is called haram. And so, haram, if you say it properly, which means unlawful or prohibited. So the two work together because the idea is that if you make certain you don't have anything that's haram, then you're going to have something that's halal. So you have to know what haram means and what halal means. And it used to be, as the picture of my first slide shows, it used to be a simple matter. Back when there was little international travel, then Muslim countries basically traded among themselves. They followed their religious obligations in terms of how the animals were slaughtered. They traded among themselves. They didn't trade with other countries. And so with modern transportation, all of that has changed. So now within the past less than 100 years, you can actually fly in. Let's say you can actually order something from the United States and put it on an airplane, and in a day, it's going to be in another country. And so in the Middle East, they're importing all kinds of products. So what happened is that an issue that was quite simple and more or less restricted to food items has expanded, exponentially expanded. That's one of the reasons why you have $1 trillion market for halal, because it covers a lot more than meats. It covers cosmetics, personal care products, pharmaceutical, food ingredients, and all kinds of material that the food comes in contact with. So, and in a lot of cases, it's sort of difficult sometimes to tell whether a product is halal or whether it is haram. And so in the Muslim religion, they have a category called mashbu. Mashbu is not really halal. It's not really haram. It's questionable, which means it's subject to interpretation. I'm going to tell you a lot of issues on trade. This mashbu has caused a lot of problems, so to speak, because sometimes it's a matter of who you talk to. And it differs from country to country. A lot of things are just, pretty plain. It's halal or it's haram. Like alcohol, for example, is haram in the Islamic religion. But there are certain items that are subject to which country it's being exported to. That's one of the reasons as a person who's exporting, you have to do research to understand what the country permits and what the labeling requirements are for the particular country that you're exporting to. Now, in a general sense, very basic sense, everything is halal except for certain items. And I'm going to show you those items on my presentation. Okay, this is just a definition of halal, basically what I've already told you. And then I also mentioned here about kosher, but these are things that I've already mentioned. As a general rule, most kosher foods not containing alcohol are also halal. However, there are some exceptions, and this article lists the similarities and differences. Anyhow, there's an article that I have that I can actually send everybody. It has a lot more detail about the similarities and the differences in kosher and halal. But in general, the alcoholic beverages are considered haram or forbidden. And here's the list. The ones that most people know about is pork, and also certain carnivorous animals are not allowed. These items or these forbidden foods almost totally parallel to kosher. They're almost exactly the same. Oh, sorry, go back one. But the difference is that when kosher actually requires that the way the food is prepared has to be adhered to in terms of not to mix dairy products with certain other kinds of proteins and meats. And so there's certain restrictions and regulations that govern them in terms of how closely you can have certain food items prepared together. That's why if you are going to eat in a kosher establishment, you're going to have someone from the religious establishment who is actually going to have to be there to make certain that the food is prepared in a way that is not been done, that's a way that's been done properly, with certain items that are not supposed to be prepared together, like dairy products and certain meat products are not supposed to be prepared together. Whereas if you are having food prepared in an Islamic establishment, those concerns are a lot less. So it means you can sell your product to an establishment, and then that establishment can go ahead and prepare it and sell it. It's not as adhered to as closely. Now, this is a map of the major, I would say, monotheistic religions and other religions as well. As you will see that most of Africa and the Middle East and large parts of Asia are practice Islam. And then you have other countries, primarily Christianity, which is about 2 billion people, and Islam is about 1.8 billion people who practice those religions. Now, this process is a very important process to understand, the halal certification accreditation process. Anybody who's exporting any food products to the Middle East or to Asia need to understand this process. And I hope by the end of this webinar, it's going to be really plain and clear as to what they mean and how it works. Now, I came up with these little icons just to make it clear what I'm talking about. Every country, let's say, for example, let's use Saudi Arabia, for example. Saudi Arabia has standards for any product that's imported into that country that has a halal label that is considered halal. There's certain inspections that have to be done on the product, whether it be an animal product, whether it be a cosmetic, any kind of product that has a halal designation has to have certain procedures taken in how that food was prepared. So the government issues, and they don't issue these every year, they issue these when they have to, regulations for food that is imported into the country that's considered halal. That's the first thing. Up until about, I would say, 5-10 years ago, every individual government had its own regulations. The regulations in the Middle East, though, were harmonized through what's called the Gulf Cooperation Council. So the regulations for Saudi Arabia and the regulations for importing food into the UAE, United Arab Emirates, were similar, not exactly the same. You know, go back to that mashbu I was talking about. There's certain items that is subject to interpretation by the importing country. But in general, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, all those countries part of the Gulf Cooperation Council have very similar import regulations. Now, the big change occurred about 5 years ago, and it occurred in the UAE, where the government said that, and this is how it was regulated. So the government entity would send an inspection team to each country to examine the slaughterhouses, the certifiers, the organization called certifiers that we'll discuss in a minute, and see if they are inspecting the food according to Islamic laws and according to halal regulations. And to show you how this system does not work, did not work well and still does not, is when I was the agricultural counselor in Dubai about 5 years ago, the government sent a team, an inspection team to the United States to look at, we had 7 certifiers at the time in the United States. So the government was sent out a team to inspect the certifiers' records, et cetera, and to visit the slaughterhouses, et cetera, and to determine whether or not that particular certifying organization could be deemed credible enough and worthy, so to speak, of being able to certify foods that are being imported into the UAE. Every country in the Middle East and in the Muslim countries around the world were doing exactly the same thing. So the certifiers, which I'm still going to wait a moment before I get to them because it won't make sense unless I go in the right order. Actually, the certifiers were having to adjust their operations depending on which country they had to certify meat for, or cosmetics, or whatever the products might be. And so they were constantly having to change, and they still are. So about 5 years ago, okay, let me go back. Prior to my becoming the agricultural counselor in Dubai, the government of UAE had not sent an inspection team to the United States for 10 years prior. So because there are so many countries that are exporting food to the Middle East, it's impossible almost for a government to have inspection teams sent to every exporting country. So they said, okay, we're going to have to come up with a new system. So the UAE said, we're going to come up with what's called a foreign accreditation body. And that foreign accreditation body is going to work on behalf of our government. So in the UAE's situation and case, they said they selected an organization called American Association for Laboratory Accreditation. That organization is responsible for setting standards, industrial standards of all kinds. So they are a regulatory body. They actually accredit laboratories. And so they're very regulatory oriented. They also follow closely to the standards organization standards, the International Standards for Standards Organization. So they are one of the best type organizations to actually oversee the certifiers. Now let me get to the certifiers, because these are the most important people when it comes to exporting, because they're the ones that your member companies or companies in the American Indian foods will have to work with to get their products certified for export, for halal export. In the United States, there are 5. There used to be 7, but I believe there's 5 now. And I put the names of the ones of 5 of them here. They all have, well, for the most part, they all can certify halal, but some have stronger emphasis than others. For example, the halal transaction, Omaha, of course, they're dealing mostly with beef and animal products of that nature. And Ifanka is I believe, is the largest. I may be wrong on that. Ifanka, the first, is located in Chicago, and they're certifying so many products as halal because the range of products that are considered halal, where it used to be meat and poultry, now is absolutely so many other kinds of product. And so they're making those certifications. Now, the halal certifiers are located in different locations around the country. This, my little diagram here is not exactly where they're located. I just put it here for just so you can understand. Um, in the United States, at the moment, or the last time I was notified about this issue, I searched this issue, there's only one accreditation issue in the United States for certifiers to work with. The idea is that having that organization in the United States means that on the behalf of the UAE government, this organization can do impromptu inspections of the slaughter facilities, impromptu inspections of the records of the certifiers. The certifiers required to have a certain kinds of records that they keep to make certain that they're in line with international certification body standards. So a lot of things change in a very short period of time for the certifiers. And of course, anytime anybody came from the government of Saudi, of the UAE to the United States, the certifier had to pay. So the certifiers are paying these surcharges, so to speak. And of course, they're going to pass that on to the customers because somebody's going to have to pay for it. So these big changes have been taking place in the whole halal space and concerning halal products that are being exported. And now the certifiers have options when it comes to how they get accredited. They can get accredited by the US organization, the Accreditation organization, or they can get accredited by at least two organizations in the UAE that have authorization to continue in a sense the old system and to send out. But the way it's working now is that the governmental entity in the UAE that's working on halal certification works with the US accreditation organization, A2LA, and they work together because the American Association, A2LA, they are not an Islamic or Muslim organization. And they may have a Muslim on staff, but they may have none. They are primarily being charged with looking at the other standards organization regulations in terms of certifier is supposed to have a management structure that reflects what a certifying body is supposed to have in place. And the reason why this is a massive change for all certifiers, not only US, there are certifiers around the world for other countries too, is because the way most of the certifiers came into existence in the United States and in other countries is they were, I would say, Muslim societies or Islamic organizations that transformed themselves into halal certifiers. So they are not strictly standards organizations. So they weren't structured for that. And a lot of them are family operations. You have the whole family, like one that I know about here in the Maryland, DC area. They have taken that as a business and as part of what they provide to the Muslim community in the United States, but they made a business out of it. So what they do is for your AIF companies, they will say, I'm producing this particular product for export to the UAE or to Saudi Arabia or to Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. Will your certification organization certify that my product is halal? So those certifiers will be they will send out their people to do an inspection. They will do an audit. And of course, your company will pay for that audit. But getting that certification will be worth it when I talk to you later about the market size for the Muslim market in the world. But the important point I want to make now is that the certifiers will be your front line organization for getting your product halal, certified as halal. Same thing for kosher. There are US organizations that are also here for, and they have a process of what the company has to go through to become classified as being eligible to export a food called kosher. So that is a general, this whole process that I'm explaining in sort of a quick way is extremely important in terms of product that's been exported to the Middle East and Asia. Now, the future of halal markets. Like I was saying, there are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. Their average age is 24 years old, very young population. You'll find that for Asia, Middle East, Africa. It's much younger population than the rest of the world, which is 32 years old. By 26, it is expected to be 3 billion Muslim. And so there's a wide bandwidth for exporting foods that are considered halal. Fine dining, fast food restaurant, in-flight food services, prisons, schools, university campuses, hospitals, and military rations. When I was in Chicago, I was asked by Ifanka, one of the certifiers, to speak at their conference in 2017 and 2019. And when I visited in 2017 and spoke at their conference about the world market for halal products, this is an updated chart of what I said when I was in Chicago at the conference. But one of the persons who served with me on the panel, it was an administrator or head person at the University of Chicago. So he asked me to have a private tour, if I wanted to have a private tour of the cafeteria facility at the University of Chicago. And I said, yes. And so I went on a private tour. I met the restaurant manager for all of the cafeterias and eating establishments on the campus. And he specifically took me to the halal station. And he showed me the halal station. He had a kosher station. He had general food that everybody could eat, irrespective of the religious perspective. The point I wanted to make is for the kosher section, there had to be a religious person at the restaurant to make certain that the food was prepared a certain way and that certain foods that weren't supposed to be mixed, dairy and other protein products, were cooked and prepared properly and separately. For the halal station, halal station is one of the most popular stations at the University of Chicago. And it's not so much that you have so many Muslims that go to school there. It's because non-Muslims like halal food. For whatever reason, maybe it's the way it's prepared, the way the taste is. It's one of the most popular stations at the University of Chicago. And it's one of those examples of how the market for halal food, even like kosher food, it's extremely large because people like the food. They like the fact that the food is, the preparation of the food and everything that is involved in bringing that food to the table is done with a lot more, I would say a lot of care. As far as the future markets are concerned, big markets in Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, China, Indonesia, the US of A, of course, and in the EU countries also. And as you can see, the Muslim consumers spend a lot of money on food like everybody else would love to eat. So in general, those countries are importing like 1.2 trillion US dollars of food per year. 100 billion of that is considered organic. And then there's imports for tourism, media, finance, pharmaceuticals, and clothing. And so there's a lot of market potential for exporting halal food, or even importantly, trading halal foods here in the United States. There's a big market in the United States as well. There are the big multinational companies are all on board with the halal. You look at the big name, Cargill, Nestle, Unilever, etc. They all have multi-million-dollar, maybe billion-dollar investments in halal now. And of course, McDonald's, KFC, Carrefour out of France, all those companies are investing huge amounts of money in the halal space. And then there are companies that are overseas in Muslim countries that are big companies. Lulu is one I know quite well. I met the person who has Lulu, and that they are based in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates in UAE, but they have grocery stores around the whole region, and they're big. They're very, very large. They're the equivalent of you walk in the United States, and I think called Alberts on the West Coast, and some of those Albertson on the West Coast, and some of the other big supermarkets on the West Coast. You walk in the store in Lulu's, it's just like walking in a great big supermarket in the United States. And they are all selling, they're importing halal foods every day. These are the big Muslim countries when it comes to expenditures on food. Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, $170 billion worth of food. That's over $1 trillion worth of food. And Turkey, $170 billion worth of food. Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, 86 billion, on down the line. Those countries are importing a lot of food, and almost all of, in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia, which I'm going to talk about in a second, they have a requirement that all food products imported into those countries has to be certified halal. When I first learned that, I was blown away. But it's an important factor to consider. That means that anything that anybody eats has to be certified halal. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. It can exclude certain foods. It can help you if you're exporting food that is deemed halal. And some of the top, as I said, Indonesia, these are some of the products that Indonesia is importing now that are the top items to be imported. And also in Malaysia, some of the same products. Those products now, if you're doing business in those, you should be looking for Indonesia, Malaysia, or that part of Asia. And in the UAE, right now they're importing a lot of nuts. Hay is a big import item, snack foods, prepared foods, meats, poultry and chicken, poultry, and other kinds of meats, turkey, also beef, etc. They're importing quite a bit of that from the United States right now. And Saudi Arabia importing a lot of hay. And in the future, they'll probably be importing a lot more since the government cut local production by about 42%. And so now they're going to have to cover that with imports. Dried nuts, corn, soybeans are big products that are being imported from Saudi Arabia right now. Now, this is the important thing. What you need to do as a company to access this global halal market. One of the first things you need to do is you need to go to the link that you see on the screen, the Food Safety Inspection Service link, and it tells you this is for meat and poultry. But you're going to find on that link just general information about the local country's requirements for importing. And for example, if you want to export to the UAE, you would go to their website, and they will have on that site everything you need to know in terms of what certifications are required in the UAE for exporting your product. And if you were on our webinar last week, you would have heard me say that a lot of the product that's been imported in the Middle East is actually not being exported by you as an exporter to the Middle East. It's actually going to be exported or sent to a consolidator based in the United States. For example, Lulu's that I talked about a few moments ago opened up about 5 years ago, a big warehouse in New Jersey. So the company, even though you have to meet all of the standards that are listed on the export requirements that you'll find on the Food Safety Inspection Service website, you don't have to worry about the transportation costs of getting the product to UAE or to Saudi Arabia. In a lot of cases, they have domestic consolidators that you can find out later from our agricultural affairs offices who they are. And so that's where the quote would be given, how to get the product in the case for Lulu's to New Jersey, in the case for Spinneys, another big supermarket chain in the Middle East, how to get the product to California, but that's where their consolidator is. So that's step one. You can find out exactly what you have to do to export to a certain market. Step two, you can go to the USDA website for the Foreign Agricultural Service. So when I was the agricultural counselor or when I was the agricultural trade officer, I was in the US, working for the US Department of Agriculture, at the same time working for the US Embassy. It's all a part of the diplomatic service, US government service. And my job was to help companies get their products into the markets, in the foreign markets. For my part, when I was in the Middle East and UAE, most of the Middle East I covered when I was in Saudi Arabia. I was primarily trying to help companies get product into Saudi Arabia. And in other countries where I've served, in Europe or wherever, I was always helping companies, US companies, get their products in that country. So my successors and folks that are still in the service are located around the world. So the link that I'm sharing, you will see contacts for all those offices, and they work for you. They are there for you. Any question you have on what is required to get my product into that market, what are the latest regulations, etc. And they have what is called a FAIRS report. I don't have it on this slide, but when you contact their office, you can ask for it. The FAIRS report actually gives you copies of all the certificates that are required for getting your product into that country. And so they will be your first line in terms of making contact in that country to see what the requirements are, and also to know how to get in contact with the US consolidators that where you would actually be shipping your food for export. That is an invaluable source to you as an exporter, and to you is free. You pay, when you pay your taxes, you're paying for this information and for these services. So, take advantage of them. And I'll guarantee you, when I was out there, a lot of folks took advantage of me and my staff. So take advantage of them and make certain that you are getting all your questions answered. Now, in terms of partners, other partners that you would like to, or you should know about, I think I might have to, I was looking at the Food Safety Inspection Service website yesterday, and things have changed a little bit. It used to be that they had all the halal certifiers listed, but they stopped doing that over the past couple of years. And part of the reason why is because of what went on, or what has been going on in the UAE. It used to be that the halal certifiers were the same, primarily from one year to the next. You go 10 years apart, you have the same certifiers. But now, because of all the new requirements that are being placed on the certifiers, some have dropped out of the business. So there's a lot of changes. So what the website actually tells you now, it actually tells you to go to an embassy to get the information on who the certifiers are. So that is that you have to understand. It used to be simpler, but now it's a little bit more complicated. And I would say the change took place about 4 or 5 years ago when the UAE changed the system. Now, other countries, I believe, are going to adopt the same system as UAE. So that's just going to be something you're going to have to get used to dealing with. Ivanka, I put Ivanka's site here, even though I could have put all those other certifiers down. And since their names are on previous slides, all you have to do is Google their names, and they would, all the information concerning them would come up. And the U.S. Meat Export Federation, they also have a lot of good export information, information to help you if you're exporting meat products. And same thing with the USA Poultry and Egg Export Council. They have all kinds of information on how you can export to countries in the Middle East and to Asia. That's all I have. I covered a lot of information. I know that this can't be all clear because it took me, like, I would say probably 20 years to, to understand this whole issue of halal. And I think I understand it to a certain degree now, but every time I think I understand it, it turns out it's something I don't know. And things are constantly changing, so you can't take what I say as the gospel, so to speak. You can only take what I say as a guideline. But I think I may have answered some good questions on the issue of halal and also touched on kosher too. So with that, I'm ready for any questions you might have.